One choice. One moment. One love story. Welcome to When He Chose Her. Enjoy the story. The most dangerous people at billionaire parties are never the ones holding the champagne. Elena Whitmore would later say. They're the ones everyone is too afraid to look at. The ballroom of the Glassmere Hotel shimmered like a jewelry box suspended above Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across polished marble floors, while a string quartet played softly near the 20-foot windows overlooking Central Park. Men in tailored tuxedos spoke in quiet million-dollar sentences. Women in silk gowns smiled carefully, like smiling itself required legal approval. And in the middle of all of it stood Elena Whitmore, balancing a silver tray of champagne flutes while silently wondering why rich people always looked exhausted at their own parties. Table 12 needs another bottle of Dom, muttered her manager through the tiny earpiece hidden beneath her dark hair. And smile more. These people tip like royalty. Elena adjusted the cuff of her black uniform and moved through the crowd with smooth efficiency. At 27, she had mastered the art of becoming invisible. Wealthy people rarely noticed waitresses unless something spilled. But tonight felt different. Strange. Tense. The kind of tension that floated beneath expensive perfume and polite laughter. Then the ballroom doors opened. The room changed instantly. Conversations lowered. A senator nearly dropped his drink. Two waiters standing near the dessert table straightened like nervous soldiers. Even the quartet missed a note. Elena glanced toward the entrance just as Vivian Sterling stepped inside, wearing a white satin gown that probably cost more than Elena's car. She was stunning in the way winter storms were stunning. Elegant. Cold. Dangerous. Diamonds shimmered around her throat like frozen stars while her silver heels clicked sharply against the marble floor. Beside her walked Damian Holloway, Manhattan's most untouchable billionaire. 6'3", black tuxedo perfectly fitted, dark hair brushed neatly back. The kind of man who looked expensive even standing still. But people weren't staring at Damian. They were staring at Vivian. Elena watched a waiter nearly panic while pouring her sparkling water. Another employee accidentally called her ma'am twice in the same sentence. Vivian didn't yell, didn't threaten anyone. Somehow that made her worse. She simply looked at people until they felt smaller. Elena leaned slightly toward another waitress passing by with appetizers. Why is everyone acting like she owns oxygen? The waitress almost choked, trying not to laugh. Shoo, she whispered. That's Vivian Sterling. Okay. The girl repeated. Last year she made a hedge fund manager cry in public because he brought her room temperature oysters. Elena blinked slowly. That feels emotionally excessive. The girl hurried away before answering. Elena couldn't help smiling to herself. Billionaires really did live in another ecosystem. Across the ballroom, Damian rested one hand lightly against Vivian's back while greeting investors from Dubai and Chicago. Every movement looked polished for magazines. Perfect couple. Perfect posture. Perfect future. The engagement announcement was expected before midnight. At least that's what the staff had been whispering for hours. Elena moved toward their table carrying a tray of champagne. As she approached, Vivian glanced at her briefly. The look lasted less than 2 seconds. Somehow it felt like an interrogation. Champagne, ma'am. Elena asked calmly. Vivian took a glass without thanking her. Her eyes drifted across Elena's name tag before dismissing her entirely. Damian, however, looked up, just for a second, long enough to notice Elena wasn't intimidated. Most staff avoided eye contact around him. She didn't. Thank you, he said quietly. Elena nodded once and turned to leave. Then she heard it. This fork was polished incorrectly. Vivian's voice wasn't loud, but the entire table froze anyway. A terrified busboy rushed forward. I'm so sorry, Miss Sterling. Vivian lifted the silver fork delicately between 2 fingers. There's a fingerprint near the handle. The poor kid looked about 19. He seemed moments away from cardiac arrest. Elena stepped forward before she could stop herself. I can replace it. Ma'am. Vivian handed over the fork without looking at her. But Elena noticed something strange. Vivian never touched the lower half of the utensil. Her fingers avoided the metal instinctively, almost carefully. Elena exchanged the fork for another. As she did, Vivian reached for her wine glass. Her left hand moved first, then abruptly switched to the right halfway through the motion. Tiny movement, barely noticeable, but Elena noticed everything. Behavioral psychology had taught her that years ago, people lied with words. Their bodies usually told the truth. Elena returned toward the kitchen, but her mind stayed on the fork. The way Vivian held it, the stiffness in her wrist, the split-second hesitation near the polished silver surface. Odd. Very odd. Earth to Elena, muttered her co-worker Ben while stacking dessert plates nearby. You look like Sherlock Holmes over there. Elena lowered her voice. Did you notice Vivian Sterling barely touched the silverware? Ben stared at her. I notice I make $14 an hour, and she probably owns islands. I'm serious. Please don't investigate billionaires during your shift. Elena almost laughed, but something cold slid quietly through her stomach. Across the ballroom, Vivian Sterling smiled for cameras beside Damian Holloway, while flashes exploded around them like tiny lightning strikes. Beautiful, controlled, untouchable. Yet Elena couldn't stop thinking about that fork, or the look that crossed Vivian's face when the silver caught the chandelier light. Fear, not disgust, not annoyance. Fear. And suddenly, for reasons she couldn't explain yet, Elena Whitmore became absolutely certain of one thing. Vivian Sterling was hiding something. The engagement party only became more expensive as the night went on. More diamonds arrived. More champagne disappeared. More people laughed too loudly at jokes that were not funny. Elena Whitmore moved through the ballroom carrying trays of miniature crab cakes while quietly observing the human zoo around her. Wealthy people fascinated her. Not because of the money, because of the fear. Everyone here feared losing something. Status, reputation, invitations, access, and, apparently, they feared Vivian Sterling most of all. By 10:30, the ballroom had transformed into a glittering performance. Investors from London clustered near the piano. A famous actress posed for photographs beside an ice sculpture shaped like Manhattan. Somewhere near the bar, two hedge fund managers argued about private aviation like children debating baseball cards. Elena passed them without listening. Her attention stayed on Vivian. The woman barely ate. That alone was unusual at a five-star event where chefs charged $300 a plate for artistic portions of fish smaller than a cell phone. But Elena noticed details other people missed. Vivian cut food into tiny pieces before pausing too long between bites. She avoided touching polished silver whenever possible. When servers replaced utensils between courses, Vivian subtly adjusted her posture each time the new fork caught the chandelier light. Like she was bracing herself. Elena stood near the kitchen doors polishing wine glasses when Ben approached carrying empty plates. You are doing it again, he whispered. Doing what? Looking at Vivian Sterling like you were solving a murder. Elena sighed softly. I am just curious. Curious people disappear in billionaire stories. He leaned closer. Seriously, stop staring before security tackles you into a decorative fountain. Elena smirked despite herself. I am not staring. You literally narrowed your eyes at her asparagus 5 minutes ago. Before Elena could answer, another server brushed past them carrying steak dinners toward the VIP table. Vivian's voice floated across the ballroom moments later. Calm. Sharp. I specifically requested no silver serving utensils near my plate. Elena froze slightly. The server apologized immediately and switched trays with trembling hands. Damian looked mildly confused. Vivian, it is just silverware. And I simply prefer consistency, Vivian replied smoothly. Her smile returned almost instantly for the surrounding guests. Perfect. Controlled. Practiced. But Elena caught the flicker underneath. Panic. Tiny. Barely visible. Yet real. Okay. Ben muttered quietly. That is weird. Elena did not answer. Her brain was already connecting patterns. People developed avoidance behaviors for reasons. Trauma. Memory. Fear. Shame. Sometimes all four together. 30 minutes later, Elena stepped into the employee hallway near the service elevators to grab fresh linens. The noise of the ballroom softened behind the heavy doors. For the first time all evening, silence settled around her. Then she heard voices nearby. You are tense tonight. Damian. Calm. Low. Vivian answered almost immediately. I am surrounded by reporters and strangers. Forgive me for not appearing relaxed. Elena paused beside the linen cart unintentionally. You have been distracted since dinner started, Damian said. Did something happen? A small silence followed. No, Vivian replied. Nothing happened. Elena recognized the tone instantly. Defensive people always answered too quickly. Damian sounded unconvinced. You nearly snapped at a waiter over a fork. Damian. Her voice sharpened. Please do not psychoanalyze me before dessert. Elena quietly stepped away before hearing more. She hated eavesdropping, but now the uncomfortable feeling in her stomach had deepened into certainty. Something about Vivian Sterling did not fit the image she sold to the world. Back inside the ballroom, Elena carried fresh cocktails toward a private lounge area reserved for Damien's inner circle. As she approached, she noticed Vivian standing alone near the windows overlooking Central Park. Snow had begun falling softly outside, turning Manhattan silver beneath the city lights. Vivian stared at her reflection in the glass with an expression that looked almost exhausted. Human. Vulnerable, even. Then a photographer approached suddenly from behind. Flash. Bright white light exploded across the window. Vivian physically flinched. Her left hand jerked backward so quickly that her champagne glass nearly slipped. Elena saw it clearly this time. The fear was not subtle anymore. Vivian recovered almost instantly once she realized people were watching. She smiled for the camera with elegant precision while the photographer apologized awkwardly. But Elena had already seen enough. Later that evening, the kitchen erupted into chaos before dessert service. One of the pastry chefs burned his hand on caramel sauce. Two servers argued over missing wine pairings. Someone dropped an entire tray of creme brulee onto the floor. The sharp crash echoed through the service hallway. Elena instinctively turned toward the noise. So did Vivian. Their eyes met across the ballroom for exactly 1 second. And for the first time all night, Vivian Sterling looked genuinely afraid of someone. Not Damien. Not the investors. Elena. It vanished quickly. Vivian turned away before anyone else noticed. But Elena's pulse had already quickened. People with nothing to hide did not react like that. Near midnight, Damien finally stepped onto the ballroom stage to thank guests for attending. Cameras lifted immediately. Applause rolled through the room like controlled thunder. Vivian stood beside him in flawless white satin, one hand resting lightly against his arm. Beautiful couple. Billionaire fairy tale. The entire city would envy them tomorrow morning. Elena stood near the back wall holding a tray of champagne while watching the future Mrs. Holloway carefully. Damien spoke confidently about loyalty, partnership, and building a future together. Vivian smiled beside him at exactly the right moments. Yet beneath the diamonds and polished perfection, Elena noticed one final detail. Vivian's right hand never stopped trembling whenever silver reflected near the stage lights. And suddenly Elena realized something that made the hairs rise along her arms. Vivian Sterling was not afraid of silverware. She was afraid of remembering something. By 1 in the morning, Manhattan looked softer from 40 floors above the city. Snow drifted slowly between skyscrapers while black luxury cars lined the streets below like polished chess pieces. Inside the Glassmere Hotel, however, perfection was beginning to crack around the edges. Wealthy people became careless after midnight. Ties loosened. Voices sharpened. Smiles grew honest or dangerous depending on the alcohol content. Elena Whitmore carried empty champagne glasses toward the kitchen while mentally replaying every strange movement Vivian Sterling had made all evening. Fear. Patterns. Avoidance behavior. Hyper-awareness around reflective metal. It was not random. Trauma always left fingerprints somewhere. You are still thinking about Fork Lady, aren't you? Ben asked while loading dirty plates into a service cart. Elena sighed. Please never call her that again. You know I am right. He lowered his voice dramatically. Somewhere in this building there is definitely a billionaire assassin named Fork Lady. Elena laughed quietly despite herself. You watch too many documentaries. And you investigate rich people too much. Before she could answer, her manager hurried into the kitchen looking stressed enough to combust. We need 3 more bottles of champagne in the North Lounge. Now, Holloway's investors are staying another hour. Everyone groaned softly. The staff had already been working nearly 12 hours. Elena grabbed a silver ice bucket and headed toward the private lounge area overlooking the hotel terrace. Unlike the ballroom, the North Lounge was quieter, more intimate. Leather chairs, dark wood walls, low jazz playing through hidden speakers. The kind of room where billionaires discuss things normal people never heard about. Elena stepped inside, carrying the champagne bucket carefully. Damien Holloway stood near the fireplace speaking with 2 older investors, while Vivian sat nearby scrolling through her phone. Even seated, she somehow radiated authority sharp enough to cut glass. Elena moved silently toward the bar counter. Another bottle for the table, sir. she said professionally. One investor nodded without looking up. Damien glanced toward her briefly. Thank you. Again, polite. Simple. But unlike most wealthy men in rooms like this, Damien actually looked at people when they spoke. Elena noticed that immediately. Vivian, however, barely acknowledged her presence. Her attention remained fixed on her phone screen until a waiter accidentally bumped the edge of the table beside her. A fork slid from a dessert plate and clattered softly onto the marble floor. The sound was small, tiny even, but Vivian reacted instantly. Her shoulders tightened. Her breathing visibly paused. The phone nearly slipped from her hand. Elena saw Damien notice it this time too. His expression shifted subtly. Concern. Confusion. Vivian, he asked quietly. I am fine. Too fast again. Too rehearsed. Elena bent to retrieve the fallen fork. As she picked it up, she noticed something else. Vivian's eyes were locked onto the polished metal surface like it might expose her secrets aloud. Then, suddenly, Vivian stood up. Excuse me, she said smoothly. I need air. She disappeared toward the terrace before anyone could respond. One investor chuckled awkwardly after she left. Wedding planning stress? Damien forced a faint smile, but his eyes stayed on the terrace doors. Elena quietly carried the fork toward the service tray. Leave it, Damien said unexpectedly. She looked up. Sir. He nodded toward the utensil. I think that fork has caused enough emotional damage tonight. Elena almost smiled. Almost. There it was again. Dry humor hidden beneath billionaire control issues. Yes, sir. As the investors resumed talking business, Damien stepped away from them and walked toward the terrace. Elena should have left. Instead, curiosity rooted her in place for one dangerous second too long. Through the glass doors, she could see Vivian standing alone outside beneath the terrace heaters while snow drifted beyond the skyline. Damien approached her carefully. Even from inside, Elena could feel the tension between them. Vivian folded her arms tightly. Damien said something she could not hear. Vivian answered sharply. Then came silence. Long silence. The kind couples had when one person was hiding something and the other person finally sensed it. Elena quickly looked away before Damien turned back toward the lounge. 5 minutes later, Vivian returned alone. Perfect again. Composed. Elegant smile restored. It was almost frightening how quickly she rebuilt the mask. As she passed Elena near the doorway, Vivian suddenly stopped. You are new here. Elena met her gaze calmly. Yes, ma'am. Vivian studied her face for a second longer than comfortable. You observe people too much. Elena felt a strange chill move down her spine. Occupational hazard. Vivian's lips curved slightly. Not warmth. Not amusement. Recognition. That can become dangerous in certain environments, she said softly. Then she walked away. Elena stood frozen for half a heartbeat. She had not imagined it earlier. Vivian knew she was being watched. Worse, she knew Elena had noticed something. Later that night, the event finally ended. Guests disappeared into elevators and black SUVs while exhausted staff cleaned champagne, stains from marble counters worth more than suburban homes. Elena stepped into the underground employee parking garage shortly after 2 in the morning, wrapping her coat tighter against the cold. Her feet hurt. Her back hurt. And her brain absolutely refused to stop replaying Vivian Sterling's behavior. Long night, a voice asked nearby. Elena turned sharply. Damien Holloway stood beside a black Aston Martin near the garage exit, one hand in his coat pocket. Without the ballroom lights and crowds surrounding him, he looked strangely different. Less untouchable. More tired. Elena straightened slightly. You almost gave me a heart attack. That would be terrible for the hotel reviews. She blinked once in surprise before realizing he was joking. Barely, but still joking. Damien glanced toward the garage ceiling thoughtfully. You looked at my fiancée tonight the way detectives look at suspects in crime movies. Elena stared at him carefully. And you looked at her like a man trying to solve a math problem with missing numbers. That caught him off guard. Just slightly. Interesting answer. Silence settled briefly between them while snow blew faintly through the garage entrance. Then Elena made a decision she probably should not have made. Your fiancé is terrified of forks, she said quietly. Damien actually laughed. Not loudly, but genuinely enough to echo softly through the empty garage. That, he said, shaking his head once, is the strangest sentence anyone has ever said to me. Elena did not laugh back. I am serious. The amusement faded slowly from Damien's expression when he realized she meant it. And for the first time that night, the billionaire looked at the waitress not as hotel staff, but as someone who might know something he did not. New York looked colder at 4 in the morning. The city lost its glamour after midnight. Garbage trucks replaced limousines. Steam rose from subway grates like exhausted ghosts. And inside her tiny queen's apartment, Elena Whitmore sat cross-legged on her couch, still thinking about Damien Holloway's expression in the parking garage. Confused, curious, unsettled. Billionaires were not supposed to look unsettled, especially not because of a waitress talking about silverware. Elena pulled her oversized sweatshirt tighter while balancing an old laptop on her knees. Rain tapped softly against the apartment window. Somewhere upstairs, a neighbor argued loudly about laundry at an unreasonable hour. Normal life. Comfortable life. Far away from crystal chandeliers and dangerous women in satin gowns. Yet Vivian Sterling remained lodged in Elena's thoughts like a splinter. Fear always had patterns. Elena learned that years ago during her behavioral psychology courses at Columbia, before life became expensive and complicated. People feared what hurt them, or what exposed them. Sometimes both. She opened a search engine and typed Vivian Sterling's name. Thousands of results appeared instantly. Charity galas, magazine covers, luxury fashion campaigns, engagement rumors, interviews describing her as the ice queen of Manhattan finance. Elena clicked through article after article while sipping cold coffee from a chipped mug. Vivian's public image was flawless. Too flawless. Wealthy people usually left messy trails online. Embarrassing photographs, old scandals, college parties, failed relationships. Vivian seemed to appear out of nowhere 6 years ago, already polished into perfection. Elena narrowed her eyes slightly. That was unusual. Very unusual. She continued searching until sunrise painted pale gray light across her apartment walls. Then she found it. A photograph from 8 years earlier buried deep inside an archived business article about a biotech company fire in Boston. The image quality was terrible, grainy, cropped awkwardly. But Elena immediately leaned closer to the screen. A woman stood near the edge of the photograph being guided toward an ambulance. Dark coat, hair partially covering her face, left hand wrapped heavily in white bandages. The article mentioned only one employee by name, Clara Vale, junior chemical researcher, missing after the incident. Elena stared at the woman's posture. Even blurry, something felt familiar. She opened another browser tab beside a recent photo of Vivian Sterling at a gala in Monaco. Same height, same sharp jawline, same habit of angling slightly away from cameras. Elena's pulse quickened. No way, she whispered softly. She enlarged both images side by side. Then she noticed it. The hands. In every modern photograph, Vivian positioned her left hand carefully, hidden beneath gloves, folded beneath her right wrist, resting against a purse or champagne glass at exact angles. Deliberate concealment. Elena sat back slowly. Okay, she muttered to herself. That is not normal rich person weirdness anymore. Her phone buzzed suddenly, nearly making her drop the laptop. Ben, please tell me you are asleep and not building conspiracy theories about billionaires. Elena laughed quietly despite herself and answered the call. Good morning to you too. It is 6:30 in the morning. No one cheerful can be trusted right now. She rubbed her tired eyes. Ben, do you remember the woman from the biotech article I showed you last month? The skincare company disaster? Yes. Silence. Then his voice sharpened slightly. Why? Elena hesitated briefly. I think Vivian Sterling might be Clara Vale. Another silence. Longer this time. Elena, I know how that sounds. It sounds like the beginning of a documentary where somebody disappears. She smiled faintly. You are dramatic. And you are terrifyingly calm about things that should not be calm. Elena looked again at the side-by-side photographs on her laptop. People reinvent themselves all the time. Not into billionaire fiancés. Fair point. Ben exhaled heavily into the phone. Please promise me you are not actually going to confront these people. Elena almost answered immediately. Then she remembered Vivian's eyes at the ballroom. Cold. Intelligent. Nervous. I am just observing, she said finally. That sentence has never ended well in human history. After hanging up, Elena showered quickly and changed into jeans and a dark coat before heading back into Manhattan. Most people would have slept after a 14-hour shift. Elena instead found herself standing outside the New York Public Library 2 hours later, carrying coffee and unresolved curiosity. Old newspaper archives filled the lower research level. Quiet rooms, dusty records, forgotten scandals. The kind of place wealthy people hoped nobody visited anymore. Elena spent nearly 3 hours searching articles connected to Clara Vale. Most reports were vague. Corporate statements, insurance settlements, mentions of laboratory safety failures. But one detail appeared repeatedly. Clara Vale disappeared immediately after the incident. No confirmed photographs afterward. No public interviews. No death certificate either. Just gone. Elena leaned back in her chair slowly while fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Missing people rarely vanished completely without help. Money helped even more. Her thoughts drifted unexpectedly toward Damian Holloway. Powerful. Intelligent. Controlled. Did he know? Was he protecting Vivian knowingly? Or had he fallen in love with someone wearing a carefully manufactured identity? Elena was still thinking about it when her phone vibrated again. Unknown number. She frowned before answering cautiously. Hello. A calm male voice replied instantly. I hope this is not inappropriate, but your manager gave me your number after I convinced him this was not a kidnapping situation. Elena nearly choked on her coffee. Damian Holloway. That is somehow not comforting. She heard the faintest trace of amusement in his voice. Fair enough. Silence lingered briefly between them. Not awkward. Just careful. You said something strange to me last night. Damian continued quietly. Elena glanced around the silent library instinctively. I say many strange things. About Vivian. There it was again. That tension beneath his calm voice. Why? Elena looked down at the old newspaper article open beside her hand. Clara Vale. Missing. Because, she said slowly, people do not fear forks unless they remember exactly what they are. Connected to. Silence answered her this time. Heavy silence. Then Damian spoke again, quieter than before. I think we need to have a conversation. Damian Holloway chose restaurants the way generals chose battlefields. Quiet. Controlled. Impossible to surprise him inside. Which was why Elena Whitmore immediately distrusted the private rooftop cafe overlooking the Hudson River the moment she arrived. Places with $12 sparkling water usually meant powerful people were trying to stay emotionally comfortable. Elena stepped out of the elevator into warm golden lighting and soft jazz drifting across the rooftop terrace. Manhattan glittered behind the glass railing while expensive couples pretended not to argue over seafood towers. Damian was already there seated alone near the edge of the terrace in a charcoal coat, without a tie for the first time she had seen him. Somehow he looked younger without the billionaire armor fully assembled. More human. Less magazine cover. He stood politely when she approached. You came. Elena slid into the chair across from him. You sounded concerned enough to make me curious. That is rarely a good quality. Curiosity built civilization. Damian gave her a dry look. It also built documentaries about cult leaders. Elena almost smiled. Almost. A waiter approached immediately carrying menus bound in dark leather. Elena opened hers and blinked once at the prices. This salad costs $38. Damian sipped his coffee calmly. It is artisanal. It is lettuce. A faint crack appeared in Damian's controlled expression. Not quite laughter, but close. You are very different from people I usually meet. Your usual people probably do not complain about luxury lettuce. That time he actually smiled briefly before looking away toward the skyline. The silence between them shifted after that. Softer now. Easier. Dangerous in a different way. Damian rested one hand against the coffee cup thoughtfully. You said yesterday that Vivian remembers something when she sees silver. Elena nodded carefully. I think so. That is a very serious accusation based on dinner utensils. Behavioral patterns are rarely random. Damian studied her face. You really believe she is hiding something? Elena hesitated before answering. I think fear leaves traces. And your fiancé behaves like someone terrified of being recognized. Damian looked toward the river for several seconds without speaking. Wind moved softly across the rooftop terrace, carrying the distant sound of traffic below. Finally, he spoke quietly. 3 months ago, Vivian canceled a charity gala because the venue used mirrored table settings. Elena's eyes narrowed slightly. What reason did she give? Migraine. Did you believe her? Damian gave a humorless smile. I wanted to. There it was again. Not stupidity. Not blindness. Hope. Wealthy people could buy almost anything except certainty about the people closest to them. Elena understood that suddenly. Damien lowered his voice further. Last night was not the first time I noticed something strange. Elena remained silent, letting him continue. Vivian changes details and stories sometimes. Small things. Where she attended school. Cities she claims to have visited. Childhood memories. He exhaled slowly. At first I assumed stress. Everybody exaggerates parts of themselves. Not usually entire histories. Damien nodded once. Exactly. The waiter returned carrying 2 coffees and an absurdly decorative appetizer involving truffle oil and microscopic vegetables. Elena stared at the plate suspiciously. This looks like food rich people apologize to. Damien laughed quietly into his coffee before catching himself. The sound surprised both of them. Elena noticed that immediately. Men like Damien Holloway were probably not allowed many genuine reactions. You know, he said after a moment. Most people spend conversations trying to impress me. That sounds exhausting. It is. I am too tired to impress anybody. Another small smile appeared before fading again beneath heavier thoughts. You mentioned a name on the phone earlier, Damien said carefully. Clara Vale. Elena's posture shifted slightly. I found old reports this morning. And your fiancé may have existed under another identity 8 years ago. Damien did not react dramatically. That almost made it worse. Powerful men learn to process shock privately. He simply stared at the skyline while his jaw tightened almost invisibly. Explain. Elena told him everything carefully. The biotech fire in Boston. The missing researcher. The photographs. The hand injuries. The behavioral similarities. Damien listened without interrupting once. By the end of it, the untouched appetizer sat forgotten between them. You realize how insane this sounds, he said quietly. Absolutely. And yet you still believe it. Elena met his eyes steadily. Yes. Silence settled heavily across the rooftop. Somewhere nearby, glasses clinked softly while a boat moved slowly along the dark Hudson River below. Finally, Damien leaned back in his chair. If you are wrong, I am having lunch with a waitress who thinks my fiancé is a runaway scientist terrified of forks. Elena nodded seriously. That does sound objectively ridiculous. And if you are right. His voice lowered slightly. Elena looked down at the coffee steam rising between them. Then someone spent years becoming another person. Damien stared at her for a long moment after that. Not dismissively. Not arrogantly. Like he was reevaluating something important. What did you study before the hotel? He asked suddenly. Elena blinked once at the change of subject. Behavioral psychology. That explains a lot. Life happened before graduate school happened. Damien nodded quietly, as if he understood more than she intended to reveal. Then his phone vibrated sharply against the table. The screen lit up with Vivian's name. Elena instinctively looked away. Damien answered calmly. Hey. Even through the brief silence afterward, Elena could hear tension bleeding through the call. Vivian's voice was too sharp, too fast. Damien's expression cooled gradually while he listened. No, he said finally. I am having a business lunch. Elena almost choked on her coffee. Business lunch. Right. Apparently discussing secret identities over $38 lettuce counted as corporate activity now. Damien glanced toward Elena briefly while Vivian continued speaking through the phone. Then he said something that shifted the entire atmosphere instantly. How did you know where I was? Silence. Long silence. Damien's face changed very slightly. Not anger. Realization. The kind that arrived quietly before destroying trust completely. The moment Damien ended the phone call, the rooftop no longer felt warm. Manhattan still glittered below them. Jazz still drifted softly through hidden speakers. Wealthy couples still pretended their marriages were functioning. But something invisible had shifted between the billionaire and the waitress sitting across from him. Damien placed his phone face down on the table with deliberate calm. That alone told Elena everything. Truly angry people slammed objects. Truly controlled people set them down carefully. She tracked your location, Elena said quietly. Damien stared toward the river. Apparently. You sound unsurprised. I sound tired. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Billionaires were supposed to sound confident all the time. Not exhausted. Not human. A cold breeze moved across the rooftop terrace, lifting strands of Elena's dark hair. Damien finally looked back at her. Vivian asked why I was meeting a waitress. Elena blinked once. That feels professionally insulting. I told her you were consulting on hospitality logistics, which is billionaire language for lying politely. A faint smile touched the corner of Damien's mouth before disappearing again. Then his expression sharpened slightly. She also asked whether you mentioned forks. Elena sat very still. That is specific. Exactly. Silence settled heavily between them. Elena wrapped both hands around her coffee cup slowly while her mind raced through possibilities. Fear, surveillance, damage control. None of them felt comforting. Damien leaned back in his chair. You were right about one thing. Only one. Do not ruin the moment. That almost earned him a smile. Almost. Damien glanced briefly around the rooftop before lowering his voice. Vivian has become increasingly careful lately. Elena listened closely. About what? Everything. He paused thoughtfully. Phone calls outside rooms. Sudden schedule changes. She deletes messages constantly. She even replaced half the household staff last month because she claimed they made her uncomfortable. Elena frowned slightly. Did they? I never found evidence of misconduct. His jaw tightened subtly. At the time I assumed she valued privacy. And now? Damien looked down at the untouched coffee between them. Now I am wondering if privacy and hiding are different things. Elena studied him quietly. Men like Damien Holloway were trained to trust contracts, numbers, systems, not instincts. Certainly not the observations of a waitress carrying archived newspaper clippings in her backpack. Yet here he was listening. That mattered more than he probably realized. Can I ask you something? Elena said carefully. Damien nodded once. Why are you really here? He looked mildly confused. On a rooftop overpaying for lettuce? No, her eyes stayed steady on his. Why are you trusting me? For the first time since they met, Damien Holloway looked genuinely uncertain. The silence stretched long enough for nearby laughter to drift across the terrace from another table. Finally, he answered quietly. Because everyone around me either fears me or wants something from me. Elena said nothing. You, he continued. Look at me like I am simply a person standing too close to a dangerous situation. She held his gaze another second before replying softly. You are. Something about that answer seemed to settle into him deeply. Not admiration. Not flirtation. Truth. And maybe that was rarer in his world than love. Damien glanced at his watch suddenly. I have a dinner tonight. Elena immediately sensed the shift in his tone. With Vivian? Private investor event at the Holloway residence. He hesitated briefly. Would you come? Elena nearly laughed from pure surprise. Excuse me. As staff, he clarified quickly. The catering company is short-handed. I can arrange it. You can arrange anything. You are a billionaire. That sounds judgmental. That sounds statistically accurate. A quieter version of laughter escaped him this time before his expression darkened again. I need someone there who notices things. Elena stared at him carefully. And what exactly are you hoping I notice? Damien did not answer. Immediately, his eyes drifted toward the skyline again. I do not know anymore. That answer felt more honest than anything else he could have said. 3 hours later, Elena stood inside the employee entrance of the Holloway penthouse feeling wildly underdressed for a building with its own indoor waterfall. Everything about the residence screamed controlled luxury. White marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, art worth more than entire apartment complexes. Even the air smelled expensive somehow. You okay? Ben whispered beside her while adjusting his catering jacket. Elena looked at him sharply. What are you doing here? You seriously thought I was letting you infiltrate billionaire dinner parties alone? He lowered his voice dramatically. If this becomes a true crime podcast later, I need witnesses. Elena rubbed her forehead tiredly. You are impossible, and yet lovable. Before she could answer, the penthouse doors opened. Guests began arriving in waves of diamonds and tailored suits, while soft piano music echoed through the massive living room. Elena moved carefully through the crowd carrying trays of champagne. But unlike the ballroom at the hotel, tonight felt more intimate, more dangerous. Private spaces always revealed more truth. Damien stood near the fireplace greeting investors while Vivian moved elegantly beside him in a dark emerald gown. Perfect again. Controlled again. Yet Elena noticed it immediately. Vivian's eyes kept scanning the room. Not socially. Strategically. Looking for something. Or someone. Then it happened. One of the caterers accidentally dropped a serving tray near the dining area. Silver utensils scattered sharply across the marble floor with a loud metallic crash. Every conversation paused briefly. Vivian physically recoiled. Not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice. But Elena saw her entire body tense instantly before her expression recovered. And this time Damien saw it too. Their eyes met across the crowded penthouse for one silent second. He knew now. Not everything, but enough. Vivian turned slowly toward Elena afterward. Her smile remained elegant. Her eyes did not. Then, very calmly, Vivian Sterling walked directly toward the waitress carrying the champagne tray. "You again," she said softly. Elena kept her posture relaxed. "Good evening, ma'am." Vivian stopped inches away from her. "Beautiful. Composed. Dangerous. I find it fascinating," she murmured quietly enough for only Elena to hear. "How observant certain people become right before they make terrible mistakes." The room around them continued glowing with laughter and piano music. But suddenly Elena understood something cold and certain. Vivian Sterling was no longer pretending not to notice her. Elena held Vivian Sterling's gaze without moving. Around them, billionaires laughed beside floor-to-ceiling windows while waiters carried champagne through the penthouse like silent ghosts. Somewhere near the piano, an investor bragged loudly about buying a vineyard in Napa Valley. The world continued normally. But beneath the soft music and crystal lighting, something sharp had finally surfaced between the billionaire's fiancée and the waitress. Vivian's smile remained elegant enough for magazine covers. Her eyes did not. "I am usually very good at recognizing ambition," Vivian said softly. "But you confuse me." Elena kept her tone calm. "That makes two of us." Vivian glanced briefly at the silver tray in Elena's hands before looking back at her face. "Most people who stare at powerful men want something. And what do you think I want?" "That," Vivian murmured, "is what worries me." Then she walked away smoothly into the crowd before Elena could answer. Ben appeared beside her almost immediately carrying wine glasses. "Okay," he whispered urgently. "That woman definitely buries people emotionally for sport." Elena exhaled slowly. "You heard that?" "I heard enough to update my will." She almost smiled, but her attention stayed fixed on Vivian moving gracefully through the room beside Damien. Perfect posture. Perfect timing. Perfect performance. Yet now Elena could see tiny fractures everywhere. The over-controlled smile. The constant awareness of exits. The way Vivian subtly positioned herself away from reflective serving trays whenever possible. Fear had rhythms once you recognized them. "You were right." Ben muttered quietly. "Something is seriously off with her." Elena nodded faintly. Across the penthouse, Damien looked toward her briefly. Not long enough for anyone else to notice. Long enough for Elena to understand he had been watching the exchange. Before either of them could react further, a member of the household staff approached Damien nervously. "Sir, the Dubai investors would like everyone seated for dinner." Damien nodded once, and the room shifted instantly into motion. Guests moved toward the massive dining room overlooking the city skyline, where a 30-foot walnut table stretched beneath hanging glass lights. Place settings gleamed beneath the soft lighting. Crystal glasses, silver chargers, polished forks aligned perfectly beside every plate. Elena noticed Vivian stop walking for the smallest fraction of a second when she entered the dining room. Then the mask returned immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen," Damien announced calmly as guests took their seats. "Thank you for joining us tonight." Elena and the catering staff moved quietly around the room, pouring wine, while conversations resumed. Elena stayed near the far end of the table, watching carefully. Vivian sat beside Damien, speaking smoothly with an older investor about European markets. To anyone else, she appeared flawless. But Elena saw her fingers tightening slowly against the stem of her wine glass every time candlelight reflected across the silverware. Then came the moment everything tilted. One of the investors, a loud man named Richard Hale, laughed while cutting into his steak. "Damien," he said, pointing his fork playfully across the table, "you still owe me a rematch in golf after that disaster in Palm Beach." The fork flashed briefly beneath the chandelier light. Vivian froze. Tiny reaction, barely visible, but this time several people noticed. Richard lowered the utensil awkwardly. "Everything okay?" Vivian blinked once before smiling too quickly. "Of course." But her voice sounded thinner now. Damien watched her carefully. Elena watched Damien. The entire room felt tighter suddenly. Then Richard made the mistake wealthy men often made. He joked when nervous. "You look like you have seen a ghost." Small laughter scattered politely around the table. Vivian did not laugh. Instead, she stood abruptly. Her chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor. Silence followed instantly. "Excuse me," she said quietly before leaving the dining room without another word. The room remained frozen for 2 uncomfortable seconds after she disappeared. Then conversations resumed awkwardly, softer now. Damien rose from his chair. "Continue without us." He moved toward the hallway after Vivian, but before leaving, his eyes met Elena's across the room again. This time there was no confusion left in them, only concern. 20 minutes later, Elena stepped into the service hallway carrying empty wine bottles when she heard raised voices nearby. Not shouting, controlled anger. Somehow worse. She slowed instinctively near the partially open study door. "You are questioning me because of a waitress?" Vivian's voice cut sharply through the silence. Damien answered lower, calmer. "I am questioning inconsistencies. You are humiliating me. I am asking simple questions." "No," Vivian's voice trembled slightly for the first time. "You are looking at me differently now." Silence followed. Then Damien spoke carefully. "Who is Clara Vale?" The stillness afterward felt enormous. Elena's pulse quickened instantly. Through the narrow opening of the study door, she could see Vivian standing perfectly motionless near Damien's desk. Her face had gone completely pale. "I do not know what that name means," she said finally. Too carefully, too measured. Damien stepped closer slowly. "That is interesting." His voice remained calm, but colder now. "Because you stopped breathing for 3 seconds when I said it." Elena closed her eyes briefly. Behavioral observation. Damien had learned faster than she expected. Inside the study, Vivian laughed softly. Not warmly. "This is insane." Then explained the photographs. Another silence. Then Vivian's expression changed. Elena could not describe it fully afterward. The fear disappeared. The mask disappeared too. What remained looked exhausted. Cornered. Human. "You should not have involved outsiders," Vivian said quietly. Damien stared. At her. Meaning Elena? Meaning anyone capable of noticing things. She turned toward the dark city skyline beyond the study windows. Observant people ruin carefully built lives. Damien's voice lowered. "Who are you really?" Vivian looked down at her own left hand resting near the desk. Slowly, almost unconsciously, her fingers curled inward as if remembering pain. Then she whispered something so softly Elena nearly missed it. "Someone who survived." Before Damien could answer, Vivian suddenly turned toward the doorway. Toward Elena. Their eyes locked instantly through the narrow opening. Elena felt her entire body go still. Vivian had known she was there the whole time. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Elena stood frozen outside the study door, holding an empty silver tray, while Vivian Sterling stared directly at her through the narrow opening. The city lights behind Vivian painted cold reflections across the room, turning the billionaire's fiancée into something almost unreal. Damien looked between them slowly. The silence itself felt dangerous now. Vivian was the first to speak. "You should teach your staff not to eavesdrop." Her voice had regained its elegance. Calm. Controlled. But Elena noticed the difference immediately. The mask no longer fit perfectly. Tiny cracks remained around the edges. Damien turned toward the doorway fully. "Elena." She stepped inside carefully before pretending confidence she did not entirely feel. "I was returning to the kitchen." Vivian smiled faintly. "And accidentally discovered my entire existence." Elena set the tray quietly against a side table. "You already knew I was observing you." "Of course I did." Vivian's gaze never left her face. "You notice details normal people ignore." Damien crossed his arms slowly. "Then maybe you should answer the question." Vivian finally looked at him. Not angry now. Just tired in a way expensive makeup could not hide anymore. "You think I lied to you about everything, did you?" The softness in Damien's voice somehow hurt more than accusation would have. Vivian looked away first. That answered enough. Outside the study, distant piano music still drifted through the penthouse. While wealthy guests laughed over dessert, completely unaware the perfect engagement was quietly collapsing behind closed doors. Vivian walked toward the bar cart near the windows and poured herself water with steady hands. No trembling now. No panic. Just exhaustion. "My real name was Clara Vale," she said finally. Damien's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Elena stayed silent. Vivian stared down into the water glass while speaking. 8 years ago, I worked for a biotech company outside Boston. There was an accident in one of the labs. Her fingers curled slightly around the glass. People blamed me immediately. Were they right? Damien asked quietly. Vivian closed her eyes briefly before answering. Partially. The room remained perfectly still. I made mistakes, she continued softly. Young researchers trying to impress executives usually do. But the company needed someone disposable after the investigation started. Elena watched her carefully. For the first time since meeting Vivian Sterling, she saw something genuine beneath the perfection. Fear, shame, survival. Vivian looked toward her left hand unconsciously. The fire left permanent damage. Damien's voice lowered further. So you disappeared. A faint, humorless smile crossed Vivian's face. No, I was erased. She explained slowly after that. The lawsuits, the media attention, investors protecting themselves, executives shifting blame quietly downward until Clara Vale became toxic enough that nobody would hire her again. Every interview ended the same way, she said. They looked at my hands first, then my name. Elena felt something uncomfortable settle in her chest. Sympathy. She had not expected that. Vivian looked toward the skyline. So eventually, I stopped being Clara Vale. Damien stared at her in silence for several long seconds. You could have told me. Vivian laughed softly. Not bitter. Just sad. Really? She turned toward him. Damien, your entire world survives on image. Reputation. Control. Do you honestly believe Manhattan would celebrate a billionaire marrying the woman once blamed for destroying a laboratory? Damien did not answer immediately. That silence mattered. Vivian noticed. It too. Exactly, she whispered. The room grew quieter after that. Elena suddenly understood something important. Vivian Sterling had not become cruel overnight. She became controlled because control was the only thing keeping her new life alive. Then Vivian looked directly at Elena again. The fork. Elena blinked once. Vivian smiled faintly. You still want to know? Elena answered honestly. I think you were afraid of remembering the accident. Vivian's expression shifted slightly. No. Her eyes drifted toward the silver serving tray beside the desk. After the fire, I woke up in the hospital unable to hold metal utensils properly because of the nerve damage. Her voice remained calm, but quieter now. Physical therapy involved learning to use silverware again. Damien looked at her carefully. And every fork reminds you. Vivian nodded once. Tiny movement. Some memories attached themselves to ordinary objects. Silence settled heavily across the study. Elena suddenly remembered something her psychology professor once said. Trauma rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it hides inside everyday emotions nobody else notices. Damien moved closer slowly. Why track my phone today? Vivian's face hardened slightly again. Because suddenly you were having secret meetings with a waitress asking questions about my past. You could have trusted me. I trusted survival first. That answer landed heavily between them. Before Damien could respond, raised voices echoed faintly from the dining room outside. Then came hurried footsteps. Ben burst awkwardly into the study looking horrified. Okay, small update, he said breathlessly. Apparently one of the investors recognized Clara Vale's name from old news reports, and now half the dining room thinks there is either corporate espionage or witness protection happening. Elena closed her eyes briefly. Ben. I panicked. Damien rubbed one hand across his face slowly while Vivian stared toward the ceiling as if reconsidering every life decision leading to this moment. Wonderful, she murmured. The next 30 minutes unfolded exactly the way wealthy scandals always did. Quietly at first, then everywhere all at once. Investors began leaving early. Staff whispered in hallways. Phones glowed beneath dinner tables as guests searched old articles online. By midnight, several media blogs had already posted vague rumors about Damien Holloway's mysterious fiancée and a hidden identity connected to a biotech scandal years earlier. Elena stood near the penthouse windows watching black cars disappear into snowy Manhattan streets while the empire of perfection cracked apart behind her. You know the worst part? Vivian said quietly nearby. Elena turned toward her. Vivian gave a tired smile. I spent years becoming someone untouchable. Her eyes drifted toward the silver utensils abandoned on the dining table outside the study. And in the end, a waitress with a fork destroyed the entire illusion. Elena looked at her carefully before answering softly. No, Vivian frowned slightly. Elena's voice remained calm. The illusion was already breaking. I just happened to notice the sound first. 3 months later, Manhattan had already moved on. The city always did. 1 week after the scandal, financial blogs replaced Vivian Sterling with newer headlines involving cryptocurrency lawsuits and celebrity divorces. Investors stopped whispering. Socialites found new parties. The empire of Damian Holloway survived exactly the way powerful empires usually survived. Quietly. Efficiently. But some things did not return to normal. Elena Whitmore still worked evening shifts at Bellamy's Diner on the Lower East Side, where coffee cost $3 instead of $38, and nobody discussed mergers over imported oysters. She preferred it that way. The diner smelled like cinnamon pancakes and old jazz records. Tourists wandered in from the cold, asking for directions. Construction workers drank coffee beside exhausted nurses finishing overnight shifts. Real people. Honest people. The kind who did not collapse because somebody knew their real name. Outside, December snow drifted softly through the city while Elena wiped down the counter near midnight. Ben stood beside the espresso machine pretending to organize napkins badly. "You know," he said casually, "most women accidentally destroy Billionaire engagements and at least get a yacht out of it." Elena rolled her eyes. "I did not destroy anything." "Sure." He nodded dramatically. The billion-dollar relationship simply dissolved naturally after a waitress psychologically assassinated the fiancé using tableware. Elena pointed a dish rag at him. "You were never allowed to describe events again." The front door opened before Ben could answer. Cold winter air swept through the diner carrying the scent of snow and Manhattan sidewalks. Elena looked up automatically, then froze slightly. Damian Holloway stood near the entrance wearing a dark wool coat and no tie. Snow dusting lightly across his shoulders. No security team. No assistants. No billionaire performance. Just Damian. Ben looked between them once before immediately grabbing a tray. "Wow," he announced loudly. "Suddenly, I remember urgent kitchen responsibilities." Then he disappeared toward the back room like a cowardly gazelle. Elena shook her head softly before looking back at Damian. "You found the diner." Damian glanced around the small room thoughtfully. "It only took my driver 3 wrong turns and a mild existential crisis." She almost smiled. "That sounds expensive. Everything in my life usually is." He stepped closer to the counter while removing his gloves slowly. Elena noticed immediately that he looked different. Lighter somehow. Still controlled. Still composed. But less armored than before. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please." She poured fresh coffee into a white ceramic mug while Damian sat at the counter instead of taking a booth. That detail surprised her more than it should have. Wealthy men usually preferred distance. "So," Elena said carefully while sliding the mug toward him, "how is billionaire disaster recovery going?" Damian wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I spent 2 weeks apologizing to investors who were deeply offended by human complexity." Elena nodded sympathetically. "Tragic." One man actually asked whether hidden identities were tax deductible. That earned a real laugh from her. Quiet. Brief. Genuine. Damian looked at her for a second longer after hearing it. "Vivian left New York," he said eventually. "Elena's smile faded slightly. "Do you know where she went?" "Paris, I think." He stared down into the coffee steam thoughtfully. "Before she left, she sent me a letter." Elena remained silent. "She said you were the first person in years who actually saw her instead of the character she created." Snow drifted softly outside the diner windows while old Frank Sinatra music played low through the speakers overhead. Elena leaned lightly against the counter. "I never hated her." Damian looked up. She shrugged slightly. "People do strange things when survival becomes more important than honesty." "That sounds personal." Elena smiled faintly. "Behavioral psychology teaches uncomfortable truths." Damian studied her face carefully. "You know what I realized after all this? That silverware is emotionally dangerous." A quiet laugh escaped him. "That too." He reached into his coat pocket slowly and placed something wrapped in dark cloth onto the counter between them. Elena frowned slightly before unfolding it carefully. Inside rested a polished silver fork, the same one from the engagement party at the Glassmere Hotel. Elena stared at it in disbelief. "You kept this?" "Apparently it ruined my life." She looked up at him. "You say that like it is a bad thing." Damian's expression softened unexpectedly. "Maybe it saved me from building a future around somebody terrified of being known." Silence settled gently between them after that. Not awkward. Warm. The kind that arrived when two people finally stopped pretending around each other. Elena traced one finger lightly against the edge of the silver fork. "You know," she said quietly, "most billionaires would never step inside a diner after midnight. Most billionaires are exhausting. You are also exhausting. That feels unfair. You tracked down a waitress because of psychological cutlery." Damien smiled slowly into his coffee. "And yet here we are. Outside, snow continued falling across Manhattan, while taxis rolled through wet streets glowing gold beneath traffic lights. Inside the diner, the world felt smaller somehow. Simpler. Real." Damien looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "I spent years surrounded by people trying to impress me." His voice remained low and steady. "You were the first person who made me feel observed instead." Elena's breath caught slightly at the honesty in that sentence. Damien glanced toward the silver fork resting between them. "I think that terrified me at first. And now," he met her eyes directly, "now I think it might be the most honest thing that ever happened to me." Somewhere in the kitchen, Ben loudly dropped an entire stack of plates after clearly eavesdropping. Neither of them looked away. Elena smiled softly despite herself. Damien smiled back this time without hesitation. No billionaire mask. No waitress invisibility. Just two tired people sitting inside a warm diner while snow covered Manhattan outside. And for the first time in months, Damien Holloway looked completely at peace. Elena folded the cloth carefully around the silver fork before setting it gently beside the register. "You know," she said quietly, "most people think truth arrives dramatically." Damien tilted his head slightly. "And you do not." Elena looked toward the snowy windows glowing softly beneath the city lights. "No," a small smile touched her face again. "Sometimes it just sounds like silver touching porcelain." If this story touched you, do not forget to like, share this video, and let us know where you are watching from. And subscribe to When He Chose Her channel for more emotional cinematic stories about love, dignity, and unexpected connections. Your support helps us continue creating powerful stories that remind us of kindness and truth still matter. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next unforgettable story.